Our government has always adopted a safe, cautious approach to offshore drilling. It's an approach that protects offshore workers in Canada as well as the environment.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Before I begin, I want to congratulate the Prime Minister and the Minister of International Trade for the agreement in principle of the Canada-Europe Trade Agreement, the largest free trade agreement Canada has completed. This is a great achievement and demonstrates that our economic action plan is working. Nous sommes ici aujourd'hui.
We are here today to talk about the new legislative provisions which are designed to amend the Canada-Newfoundland Atlantic Accord Implementation Act and to deal with occupational health and safety issues in Canada's offshore areas. Before we say any more about these legislative provisions, however, allow me to provide some context by underscoring the vital importance of our offshore resources for Atlantic Canada and for the economy of our entire country.
Offshore oil and gas industries have made an enormous economic contribution to Newfoundland and Labrador and Nova Scotia. Indeed, it is not an exaggeration to say that these industries have transformed the economy of eastern Canada. Not long ago, the province of Newfoundland and Labrador was receiving the highest per capita equalization payments in the country. Today, it is among our strongest provincial economies and now contributes to the equalization program. Newfoundland and Labrador's GDP has performed at or above the national average in 9 of the past 13 years. A large part of that success comes from offshore oil and gas, which accounted for 33% of Newfoundland and Labrador's GDP in 2011. Resource revenues, again primarily from the offshore, have allowed the province to steadily pay down its debt. Total provincial debt was about $7.7 billion in 2012, down from a high of $12 billion just 8 years ago. Simply put, offshore energy development has given Newfoundland and Labrador more jobs, lower taxes, and new investments in services and infrastructure that play such an important role in building stronger communities. And these benefits will continue to grow. As you know, Hibernia was the largest project of any kind ever undertaken in Newfoundland and Labrador. And as valuable as Hibernia has been, the Hebron project may be even bigger. Hebron represents a capital investment of as much as $14 billion. It could deliver $20 billion in taxes and royalties to the province over the 30-year life of the project. Just a few months ago, the Canada-Newfoundland and Labrador Offshore Petroleum Board announced its latest calls for bids for exploration and licenses offshore Newfoundland and Labrador, netting $117 million in work commitments by major players in the oil industry. The Nova Scotia's offshore area also offers enormous potential. The Play Fairway analysis undertaken by the Government of Nova Scotia estimates that the offshore area may contain 8 billion barrels of oil and 3.3 trillion cubic feet of natural gas. The Atlantic offshore is a major gas producer with 3 gas fields serving Atlantic Canada and the U.S. Northeast. In the past 2 years, the Nova Scotia offshore area has seen the largest bids ever for offshore parcels in Atlantic Canada, with more than a total of $2 billion bid for 12 parcels of land. Shell Canada and BP Exploration clearly see the potential that exists in the Nova Scotia offshore. Meanwhile, there is an estimated 120 trillion cubic feet of natural gas, and production continues to grow. Sable Island's 270 million cubic feet a day will soon be joined by 200 million cubic feet a day from Deep Panuke. Il est essentiel que le Canada continue à faire en sorte.
It is essential for Canada to continue to ensure that offshore industries operate safely and by respecting environmental standards, the most rigorous environmental standards. Canadians expect a world-class regulatory body, and our government is taking the necessary steps in order to provide this. Therefore, that's why we are adopting new legislative provisions to clarify provincial and federal responsibilities governing occupational health and safety for the offshore sector. Mr. Speaker, this Implementation Act for the agreement is the cornerstone for all offshore oil and gas activities. This legislation provides legal authority to regulate oil and gas activities on behalf of the provinces. Canada's offshore workers are confronted on a daily basis with a difficult working environment. The weather conditions are difficult in the Atlantic region. They are far from their workplace, and these are just a couple of problems and difficulties that come to mind. The safety of these courageous men and women who work in that environment must always be our main concern.
Changes we intend to make need to be mirrored by provincial legislation in order for the amendments to come into force. Our government has been working closely with the governments of Newfoundland and Labrador and Nova Scotia to achieve this. Both provinces introduced their legislation in May, and both have given royal assent to their respective bills. This time, they must wait for the legislation to pass our federal parliament for the new regime to come to fruition. The proposed amendments will address gaps in the current legislation. They will vest authority for offshore occupational health and safety in the Accord Acts. There are two safety regimes that apply to workers in the offshore. Occupational health and safety pertains to the workers in the sense of the hazards they may face, their protective equipment, and the safeguards on the equipment they use in their functions. It also pertains to three essential worker rights: the right to refuse dangerous work, the right to information, and the right to participate in taking decisions on workplace health and safety. Under the current regime, occupational health and safety is the jurisdiction of the provinces. Operational safety pertains to the workplace systems, facilities, and equipment, as well as the risk management integrity of those systems and those facilities and equipment. Examples of this are the prevention of gas blowout, ability of a facility to withstand storms, and fire suppression systems. This was included in the Accord Acts and provided that the offshore petroleum boards be responsible on behalf of both levels of government. Following a tragic accident where a worker was killed due to an improperly installed door, the overlap of occupational health and safety and operational safety created a gray area. It was not clear whether the door's installation fell under operational safety or occupational safety. The lack of clarity prevented any party from being liable, and it was unclear under whose jurisdiction the incident should be regulated. The provinces and federal government agreed that the best course of action was to eliminate the grey area and incorporate the power for occupational health and safety directly in the Accord Acts. For the section on occupational health and safety, which typically would fall under the purview of the Minister of Labour, the legislation specifies that the Minister of Natural Resources may receive advice from the Minister of Labour, and any regulations related to occupational health and safety must be made on the recommendation of both ministers. In addition to fixing this historic issue, the legislation establishes a hierarchy of responsibility. It makes operators ultimately responsible for all activities that take place related to their authorization. It also spells out the specific duties expected of operators, employers, supervisors, employees, contractors, and interest holders. Due to the nature of the offshore, where work sites are usually hundreds of kilometers from shore, we are ensuring that the health and safety regime also applies to workers in transit to the offshore. This means workers may refuse to be transported if there are safety concerns. The legislation also includes powers to establish regulations related to additional safety equipment for workers in transit. Offshore board inspectors may also have the power to conduct compliance audits on the vessels used to transport workers. These measures will significantly enhance worker safety in the offshore. This legislation also gives new powers to offshore board officers to further enhance safety. For example, they will now have the power to inspect anything, take samples, meet in private with any individual, or inspect a living quarter. Due to the distance and isolation that offshore activities regularly require, offshore board officers will now have the power to act in exigent circumstances, that is, to act without a warrant to preserve evidence or prevent a non-compliance. The requisite warrant must be sought and granted from a judge or justice of the peace post-activity. The legislation also clarifies certain issues regarding the chief safety officer. The position of this officer may not be held by the CEO. This ensures that safety is an independent function within senior management of each offshore board. The Chief Safety Officer must review and provide written recommendations related to safety on all authorizations. This formalizes a process that both boards must follow, or are already following, I should say. Chief Safety Officers will also be granted the power to allow regulatory substitutions. They are made on application by an operator who must satisfy the SFO that the substitution provides an equivalent or greater level of safety. The SFO also may require that an operator or an employer establish a special occupational health and safety committee. The committee is in addition to the Workplace Health and Safety Committee that all workplaces with more than 5 employees must establish. We're also introducing a new appeal process for the most serious cases. In certain special cases, the provincial minister may appoint a special officer. The legislation is very clear that this may only be done where there are reasonable grounds to believe that such an appointment is warranted to avoid a serious risk to health and safety, and the risk cannot be avoided by the use of other means available through the Accord Acts. Both the federal and provincial ministers must agree that the required conditions have been fulfilled. The orders of a special officer supersede those of all other officers, including the Chief Safety Officer. These amendments will create a more transparent regime for Canada's offshore industry. The health and safety of Canadians and protecting the environment are among the Government of Canada's top priorities. And that is why Canada's offshore installations and the equipment and training required to operate them must meet strict regulatory standards that are among the highest in the world. Nevertheless, we recognize that our offshore regime can be improved, and today we are taking steps to do just that. Our government recognizes that accidents can happen anywhere, regardless of laws and safety measures. But we're also very confident in our safeguards, and we have very strong environmental laws and standards, and also a robust and well-developed safety regime for offshore exploration and drilling. For our East Coast, the Canada-Newfoundland and Labrador Offshore Petroleum Board and the Canada-Nova Scotia Offshore Petroleum Board are responsible for evaluating every project for compliance with federal regulations. Drilling cannot occur unless the responsible board is satisfied that drilling plans are safe for workers and safe for the environment. Beyond high standards for training, safety, and equipment, oil and gas companies are required to maintain environmental protection and spill response plans. The government is committed to the polluter pays principle, responsible management of risks. Responsibility rests with operators to immediately take all reasonable measures to clean up a spill and prevent further spillage. But of course, the government needs to be prepared to step in to help if need be. The regulator, the National Energy Board, and offshore boards would be the government's lead agency for the response. Using aerial surveillance and satellite imagery for detection and tracking, it can provide advice about spill trajectory modeling, weather and sea state forecasts, and warnings, location of wildlife and sensitive ecosystems, and cleanup and remediation options. Je suis sûr qu'une fois que
I'm sure that once these legislative provisions are in place, the offshore boards will do their jobs and determine what is safe for workers and for the environment. Now, I'd like to say a few brief words about the creation of a separate regulatory body for offshore safety. First of all, I want to clearly state that these legislative provisions are not linked to that issue. In fact, development on them began well before the recommendation was made for the first time. These legislative provisions were put in place following the incident that occurred in the offshore of Nova Scotia, the incident that I mentioned earlier. As regards the recommendation itself, we will continue to work with the provinces on this important issue. We have expressed concern with respect to the fragmentation of our offshore system and the proliferation of regulatory bodies. We want to ensure that the system is as simple as possible and that it, at the same time, protects the health and safety of Canadians. We will continue to discuss these matters with our provincial counterparts. Now, Mr. Speaker, our government has always adopted a safe, cautious approach to offshore drilling. It's an approach that protects offshore workers in Canada as well as the environment. All of these development activities that take place in Canada, and not just in the offshore industry, must be undertaken with a view to ensuring safety for workers and the environment. We have taken a number of steps in Canada's resources sector to ensure that this objective is the main concern for all of our regulatory bodies.
Members will support this important legislation. Thank you.
It's an extremely important piece of legislation as it affects the offshore of Newfoundland and Labrador and the workers who risk their lives in a dangerous occupation, traveling back and forth to the oil rigs, working on exploration vessels, working offshore for as much as 3 weeks at a time in an industry which is constantly changing. At the beginning of offshore exploration, Mr. Speaker, exploration was going on in shallow waters, near to shore. Now we have oil rigs and exploration going on hundreds of kilometers offshore, transportation by helicopter, which takes as much as 2 or 3 hours to get back and forth, and clearly a dangerous situation, as we know from the risks that are being assumed by individuals in pursuit not only of a livelihood for themselves and their families, but also extremely important economic activity for the province of Newfoundland and Labrador and Nova Scotia, but also for the taxpayers and the government of Canada in terms of revenue who share in the revenue from the offshore oil industry in Newfoundland and Labrador and in Nova Scotia. Unfortunately, for many, many years, going back as early as 1992, the offshore safety regime was not controlled by the provinces themselves. For workers inside Newfoundland and Labrador or in Nova Scotia, the labor portfolios had responsibility for occupational health and safety. That was taken away in 1992 by legislation and given over to the offshore petroleum boards. In their supposed wisdom of the day, they had draft regulations. Draft regulations. So there wasn't a situation where somebody who did something contrary to those draft regulations could actually be charged and treated as an offender and taken before a court and fined and dealt with appropriately and be required to follow those regulations. No, they had a very different regime. The regime was, well, we have draft regulations, and those draft regulations are really just a framework or a guideline. That was entirely unsatisfactory to the workers, Mr. Speaker, to the our party in both Nova Scotia and in Newfoundland and Labrador. Were very strongly opposed to this particular approach. I may quote from Mr. Justice or former Justice Wells on the offshore helicopter safety inquiry, who talked about this issue, because, you know, the minister claims that this has nothing to do with the Cougar crash and the Cougar inquiry, that this is something that's been going on for a long time. But it's very important to know that Mr. Justice Wells, in his inquiry into the Cougar helicopter crash that happened in March of 2009, where 18 people on board a helicopter that crashed, 17 were killed, one sole survivor. It led to an inquiry being undertaken by former Justice Wells into these fatalities, and he did a very extensive study of the offshore health and safety regime, and he talked about his work, learning about how safety and health and safety deficiencies are attended to in the offshore. And he says he's, in page 275 of his report, he said he's learned the differences between prescriptive regulation and performance-based regulations. Now, what we had in this particular situation until now was what's called performance regulations, for performance-based regulations. So, in other words, the regulator comes up with a plan and objectives for safety, and the companies decide how they shall go about meeting those objectives. Whereas the regulatory regime that we now have in this legislation says, here is what you must do, here is the standard that must be met, and they're required to comply. We've been calling for years for this power. The answer always given when you objected to the regime, which only had guidelines, was that, well, we have the ultimate power, and that is to shut down the operation if it's deemed to be unsafe. That, of course, never happened. The costs of doing that, the way of getting compliance was not satisfactory. And we get into a situation where the same agent, the same organization, the same agency that's responsible for the management of the operation, control of the operation, control of the whole of the exploration and production activity, production methods, production schedules, and all of that, is also dealing with health and safety. That's been deemed by many countries and by the Wells Commission of Inquiry to be unsatisfactory. He says in his report, in his recommendations, and recommendation number 29 has already been mentioned by one of my colleagues, the Regulation 29 recommends that there be a new, independent, standalone safety regulator. Such a safety regulator would have to be established, mandated, and funded by both governments by way of legislative amendment, regulation, or memorandum of understanding, or other terms. And he says in the lead-up to that, he said, I believe that the recommendation that follows this explanatory note will be the most important in this entire report. He says, until the end of 2009, the CNLOPB offshore operated under a primarily prescriptive regime which established the requirements under which the oil operators filed their safety plans, received authorizations, and conducted their exploration and production. The task of the regulator was to ensure that the operators adhere to what was required of them, and it was called the prescriptive system of regulation. They then changed that entirely. The regulations instituted a performance goal-based regime whereby the regulations specifically specify, and the regulator sets the goals. The operators respond by saying how they will achieve them. He wasn't satisfied with that. He said the new offshore goal regulator regime was introduced by regulation January 2010. There were no changes made at the time to the regulatory body to strengthen and prepare it for the new and much more demanding regime. And he says that there ought to be a separate, powerful, independent, knowledgeable body equipped with expert advice, and made this recommendation as follows. That's the one flaw, Mr. Speaker, in this regime. We support this legislation. We support this legislation because it brings us from a situation of operating with draft regulations to a situation where we now have regulations in force, we have authority by legislation. This has been worked on for a number of years by negotiators on behalf of the workers in both Newfoundland and in Nova Scotia, with the governments of Nova Scotia, the NDP government of Nova Scotia, and the PC government of Newfoundland and Labrador worked on these for a number of years. The Labour representatives have support this approach. They support the fact that this regulation is there. They work very hard to achieve a situation where they believe that the offshore workers have the same level of protection as the onshore workers. That's an important principle that is included in this bill, that as a result of the work of the Labour representatives in these negotiations, they believe, has been achieved. The second principle is that the protection of employees' rights to know and to participate and to refuse unsafe work and to be protected from reprisal, that's there, and support for an occupational health and safety culture that recognizes the shared responsibilities in the workplace between employees and employers for a safety regime. So that is why we support it, Mr. Speaker. We think it is a good step forward to ensure that the safety regime is covered by legislation and enforceable legislation, and that's going to be a better system to protect workers and to protect workers who refuse unsafe work. Where we have the problem is the fact that it's included in the same regulatory body as we have all other aspects of offshore development, whether they be plans for production, plans for exploration, design of facilities, and all of that. There is no separate regulator. Why should we have one? Well, when you look at other countries, in 2001, for example, Norway adopted the concept of having a separate safety regulator. A few years later, Australia did the same thing. Their rationale imposing separate safety regulators was that there may be inherent conflicts within a single regulator, which on the one hand regulates exploration and production, at the same time is required to make hard decisions which a safety regulator must make. We also have the same situation in the United Kingdom. They also believed that this was required. These changes were made, and the changes came from government, not from industry. They've been fully accepted by industry, however, and they're deemed to be working by Justice Wells in his report. And he said it was that independent minds outside the industry perceive the inherent conflict between the exploration and production on the one hand and safety on the others. One of the second problem with which goes against the notion of continuing with a single regulator is something called regulatory capture. It's well known in industry and other types of industrial regulation. Regulators and those they regulate working so closely together that friendships and close working relationships can develop. So common interests and what sometimes referred to as cozy relationships can unconsciously influence the hard decisions that safety regulation requires. I'm reading here from the report, Mr. Speaker, at page 277. Now, they didn't say, and Justice Wells didn't say that he found that type of regulatory capture in existence, relatively new and small offshore, and he didn't expect regulatory capture to occur. Nevertheless, he said every effort should be made to ensure that it never happens. So these are two of the reasons why this should be a separate regulatory body. The recommendation was, as Justice Wells said, one of the most important ones that he made. It was adopted by the Newfoundland and Labrador government. They supported that recommendation. The workers themselves support that regulation. The Newfoundland and Labrador Federation of Labour support that recommendation, number 29. We supported it in Newfoundland and Labrador, Mr. Speaker, and we support it here, that there should be a separate regulatory body. The Minister says we don't need to have a proliferation of agencies and organizations. We're not talking about a proliferation here, Mr. Speaker. We're talking about a separate safety and health and safety regime in the Newfoundland and Labrador offshore, where it's extremely important to have that concern. We've got a situation now, Mr. Speaker, and it's relevant to the Newfoundland and Labrador offshore, and also to the situation involving helicopter transport back and forth to the rigs, and that has to do with the resumption of night flights. One of the things that happened back during the course of Mr. Justice Wells' inquiry, he made an interim recommendation that all night flights of these helicopters back and forth to the rigs be stopped. That's been in place since then, since I believe it was around February of 2010 that it was he made that recommendation. It was implemented by the CNLOPB, and night flights have not been a part of the regime in the offshore, much to the relief of the workers, because part of the evidence heard during the inquiry of Mr. Justice Wells was that the survivability from a crash at night in a helicopter was significantly lowered by the fact that a crash had happened at night. We have a situation, of course, where the reason that this helicopter crashed because they had a loss of main gearbox lubricant, and they thought, and they were told, the pilots, that that helicopter had the capability of flying for 30 minutes in what's called a run-dry state with no gearbox lubricant. That's a standard for all Class A helicopters in use in the world, Mr. Speaker. Unbeknownst to the pilots, that there was an exemption given to Sikorsky, and that they didn't have that capability. 10 minutes after they lost main gearbox oil, the airplane crashed, killing 17 of the 18 people on board. The Transportation Safety Board, in its report in February of 2011, said that all Class A helicopters be required to have that the 30-minute run-dry capability, and asked the Transport Canada to enforce that ruling. Transport Canada did not accept that recommendation, and in fact, neither did they make any restrictions on these helicopters being used to transport hundreds of kilometers over the ocean and make limitations on that. They left it in place, following what the American FAA did in saying that we're not going to require Sikorsky to retrofit its helicopter fleet. That created a regime of concern by the workers offshore. They made protestations about it. They made representations to the CNLOPB, and it was maintained as a moratorium on night flights up until now. But we now have a situation where, going back, the operators, the Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers, our representatives on this, going back to the CNLOPB, seeking to resume night flights. But we now have the regulator, and we're back to this situation now where we have the regulator, which is in charge of all aspects of offshore production and safety, and production and regulation, looking at this very question of offshore health and safety. I believe that there would be more confidence of the workers and the people of Newfoundland and Labrador and Nova Scotia, knowing that a decision that was going to be made was in fact being made by a separate, independent health and safety regulator whose only mandate and only concern was the safety of workers, that they would be making that decision. They would take into consideration what the options are. Because one of the options would be, instead of having night flights, to have more helicopters. So, the issue is how many people can you transport in what period of time. The reason they want night flights and they want to fly in the dark is because they don't have enough helicopters to do the transportation in the daytime. Well, the simple solution is to have more helicopters. There's a cost involved. Yes, there is. But if safety requires that, then I would expect that an independent health and safety regulator with no other concerns other than that of the health and safety regulator would be in a better position to make that decision, even if it's a tough decision, to say that this is not going to be permitted in the offshore. So I guess that's one concrete example, Mr. Speaker, as to the concern that was raised about this issue and the need for an independent regulator. Recommendation 29 of Mr. Justice Wells' report on the offshore helicopter safety inquiry states it very eloquently, with a lot of background information, a lot of work being done, a lot of consultation and visitations to other countries, whether they be the UK, Norway, Australia, experts and expertise brought forward, and retired Justice Wells did a most thorough report and made that recommendation. It's a pity, Mr. Speaker, that it wasn't adopted by the Government of Canada. They failed to do that despite the urgings of the province of Newfoundland and Labrador, Mr. Justice Wells, the unions involved, the Federation of Labour in Newfoundland and Labrador, and many others who are concerned about the offshore health and safety regime. That being said, Mr. Speaker, we do regard this as a step forward. We do regard this Bill C-5 putting into regulation and legislation that was treated as draft regulations for nearly 20 years, and an unsatisfactory situation which is being resolved. For that reason, Mr. Speaker, we are supporting the legislation here at second reading. I see that my time is nearly up, but I would be happy, Mr. Speaker, to answer any questions or respond to any comments that my colleagues in the House would have with respect to this bill. As I say, we support it, but we are concerned that there's a lack of an independent regulator to enforce these regulations. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Natural resources are an important part of Canada's economy, Mr. Speaker. We all know this. This country was enormously blessed, not only in huge reserves of energy, Mr. Speaker, but also in massive tracts of forest and an abundance of minerals and metals. For generations, we have brought opportunity, jobs, and growth to every region of the country through this sector, Mr. Speaker. Right now, nearly 800,000 Canadians work in the natural resource sectors. Another 800,000 people are employed by industries serving these sectors. Added up, close to 1.6 million Canadians depend on natural resources for their jobs, Mr. Speaker, 10% of all employment in Canada. Put together, natural resources account for 15% of our gross domestic product and a full 50% of our exports, Mr. Speaker. When you include the spin-off industries that provide goods and services to the sector, natural resources account for nearly 20% of our GDP, or nearly 1/5 of our economy. And the important thing, Mr. Speaker, is that natural resources are poised to play an even bigger role in the years and decades ahead. In fact, over the next decade, more than 600 major natural resource projects worth over $650 billion, Mr. Speaker, over $650 billion are expected to come online across Canada. That $650 billion figure represents hundreds of thousands of really top-paying jobs in every sector of our economy and in every region of the country, Mr. Speaker. And that is why our government has a plan to unleash Canada's natural resource potential. We call it the Responsible Resource Development approach. This plan is streamlining the reviews of major projects by ensuring fixed timelines, eliminating duplication, and strengthening environmental protection, Mr. Speaker, strengthening environmental protection and improving Aboriginal consultations. Over the past year, there's been a growing interest in exploration of the offshore resources of Nova Scotia and Newfoundland and Labrador. Off Nova Scotia's coast, offshore activity is continuing to pick up, with production of natural gas from the Sable Offshore Energy Project and the startup of the Deep Panuke natural gas project. In fact, Mr. Speaker, in the past 2 years, the Nova Scotia offshore area has seen the largest bids ever for offshore parcels in Atlantic Canada, with more than $2 billion bid for 12 parcels offshore. Shell Canada and BP Exploration clearly see the potential that exists in the Nova Scotia offshore area. In Newfoundland and Labrador, the offshore oil and gas industry is contributing to a booming economy and a resurgence in the natural resource sector. In fact, Mr. Speaker, I was elected to this House 20 years ago. And for the first almost 10 years of the time I spent down here, the talk, Mr. Speaker, was of Newfoundland and Nova Scotia being a have-not province. And it seemed, Mr. Speaker, there was no hope. The fisheries sector was dying due to overfishing, and especially by international illegal fishing. The tourism industry in Newfoundland and Labrador hadn't been developed like it is now, and it truly seemed like the future for Newfoundland and Labrador was bleak. And here we are, a short 20 years later, Mr. Speaker, and Newfoundland is a have province, contributing to Canada's economy in a substantial way. And not only that, Mr. Speaker, and I guess this is kind of a bad thing for Alberta, and I'm a member of Parliament from Alberta, but we're losing the good Newfoundland workers that we depended on so much in Alberta in our resource sector. We're losing them back to Newfoundland and Labrador, but that is as it should be, Mr. Speaker. So, Mr. Speaker, the province's GDP has performed at or above the national average in 9 of the past 13 years, and offshore oil and gas accounted for 33% of the GDP in 2011. The Hibernia South Extension could return as much as $13 billion to the province in taxes and royalties, Mr. Speaker. According to a recent report from the province's Department of Human Resources, the resource sector will be the major contributor with an 8% boost in employment. That's 2,300 new jobs by 2015, Mr. Speaker. Substantial indeed for that part of the country. And an exciting thing is that there will be 23,000 new jobs in the new development of the Hebron heavy oil project and the Muskrat Falls hydro project as these projects ramp up. Mr. Speaker, Hibernia was the largest project ever undertaken in Newfoundland and Labrador. But as big as Hibernia was and is, Hebron may be even bigger, Mr. Speaker. Hebron represents a capital investment of as much as $14 billion, and it is expected to create more than 3,500 good-paying jobs for Canadians during construction alone. Hebron is still on target for its first oil by 2015. Mr. Speaker, here's the big picture. In both Nova Scotia and Newfoundland and Labrador, resource revenues continue to grow, and much of that growth is in the offshore. Exploration and development of the offshore is translating into real, tangible benefits for the people of these provinces. Benefits such as more and better jobs, tax cuts for families at all income levels, lower taxes for small businesses and new investments in service and infrastructure that help to attract new investment and build stronger communities, Mr. Speaker. And these benefits will continue to grow. To ensure these offshore activities are carried out safely, our government is introducing new legislation to improve Canada's robust offshore regulatory framework. We have been working closely with the governments of Nova Scotia and Newfoundland and Labrador to address the gaps found in the current legislation concerning occupational health and safety. And we know the Senate, Mr. Speaker, did a study on this recently and found our regulatory system to be very strong now. But, Mr. Speaker, this will improve the process further. We have to make sure we have the regulatory process that we need to go well into the future, and that's what this will help to do, Mr. Speaker. After working with the provinces, industry, regulators, and labour groups, we are improving our offshore legislation to better protect the safety of Canada's offshore workers. These changes will help to protect offshore workers by vesting with the Accords Act a strong occupational health and safety regime. Both provinces have already given royal assent to their respective bills. At this time, they must wait for the legislation, for legislation to pass our federal parliament for the new regime to come into force, Mr. Speaker. So, of course, Newfoundland and Labrador and Nova Scotia want this legislation passed as quickly as possible. Mr. Speaker, health and safety of Canada's offshore workers is a top priority with this government. Under the current regime, all offshore activities is regulated by Canada's offshore boards. Companies that want to explore offshore must provide and have approved by the province's board a detailed emergency response plan and contingency plan before any drilling can take place, and it's rigorous, Mr. Speaker. That means that Canadian regulators will not allow any offshore activity unless they are absolutely convinced that the environment and the safety of workers are well protected, Mr. Speaker. Our offshore installations and the equipment and training required to operate them must meet the strictest regulatory standard, Mr. Speaker, and this legislation just adds to the very substantial and well-functioning legislation that's currently in place, and it will lead to better things and to the appropriate regulatory regime, protect health and safety in the decades ahead, Mr. Speaker. That's what this is about, and this is something that's good for Eastern Canada and good in particular for Newfoundland and Labrador and Nova Scotia. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.